when police broke into a house in Topeka, Kansas. On January 17, 2014, they were met with a horrifying scene. Harold Sasko, 52 years old, lay dead in a pool of congealed blood, his throat stabbed multiple times to the point of near decapitation. On the bathroom wall, the word "freedom" was written in the victim's own blood, as if it were a final declaration. But what made this case one of the most controversial stories in America was not the brutality of the crime, but the identity of the killer, Sarah Gonzalez McClin, a 19-year-old beautiful girl whom Harold had nurtured as his own daughter for years. Was this a story of a cold-blooded psychopath or the tragedy of a victim of sexual abuse pushed to her breaking point? Sarah Gonzalez McClin was born on July 9, 1994, in Topeka, Kansas, in a seemingly normal family from the outside. She grew up in a homeschool environment, with a shy and kind personality. Sarah was particularly close to her older sister and devotedly cared for her disabled younger brother. However, beneath the calm exterior of her childhood were deep psychological wounds. As a young child, Sarah was sexually abused by a neighbor. This trauma left severe consequences. She suffered from recurring nightmares, persistent stress, and anxiety. These symptoms led Sarah to start running away from home and drinking alcohol at a very young age. Her parents took her to a psychologist, but her condition not only failed to improve, but worsened. Family life became more complicated when Sarah's parents decided to divorce. This event made her feel unloved and disconnected from her father. Her relationship with her mother grew increasingly strained, and Sarah began to desire to leave home as soon as possible to escape the conflict-ridden environment. Harold Sasko, 52, was the owner of 3 pizza parlors in Topeka. He was described as a devout Christian, outwardly trustworthy, and successful in business. However, behind this respectable facade, his employees noticed troubling signs. Many employees described Harold as a pervert with a particular fondness for hiring young girls to work at his establishments. Terry David, a senior manager, had warned Sarah about Harold's inappropriate behavior, but the young girl at the time thought the warnings were exaggerated. At 14 years old, Sarah began working at one of Harold's pizza parlors. He quickly recognized her vulnerability and emotional fragility. Harold initiated a sophisticated strategy to build trust and create dependency. Harold frequently picked Sarah up from school and drove her to work. He bought her gifts and necessary items, gradually asking her to view him as a father figure. Crucially, Harold insisted that their relationship be kept secret from Sarah's mother, a hallmark sign of abusers creating a special relationship with their victims. During this period, Harold skillfully exploited Sarah's existing psychological wounds. She was in a phase where she craved care and affection, especially after childhood abuse and her family's breakdown. Harold appeared as a savior, offering the stability and attention she lacked at home. At 16, Sarah endured another severe psychological trauma when she was raped by a close friend during a vacation. The assault was violent. She was pushed onto a table, causing it to break, and was burned on her back with a cigarette. This trauma compounded her earlier wounds, pushing her mental state to a critical point. Sarah was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in desperation. She attempted suicide and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. There, she received medication and therapy. However, these treatments had limited success in healing her deep emotional scars. After discharge, Sarah returned to a home environment where family tensions escalated. Her relationship with her mother deteriorated further, and the atmosphere at home became stifling. It was during this time that Harold made an offer that seemed like a solution to all her problems. He invited Sarah to live with him. Harold promised financial support, including paying for her college tuition. For a 17-year-old who had just graduated high school in 2012, feeling lost and without support. This seemed like an opportunity to start anew. Initially, life with Harold was positive. He bought her necessities, supported her with housing and education, and asked for nothing in return. Sarah felt she had found the stability and security she had long desired. However, when Sarah turned 18, Harold's true nature began to surface. He started demanding sexual intercourse from Sarah as repayment for his support. To conceal their unusual relationship from others, they posed as stepfather and stepdaughter. When Sarah refused Harold's sexual demands, he became angry and threatened to evict her. Harold exploited Sarah's substance abuse issues, a self-destructive coping mechanism for her trauma, by supplying her with drugs and then sexually abusing her when she was intoxicated. One of Harold's most manipulative tools was a debt list totaling $116,000. This list included all the gifts he had given Sarah. Cosmetic surgeries, nose job, and buttock implants he had pressured her into undergoing, and rent for living in his home. Harold used this list as a psychological weapon, making Sarah feel indebted and unable to leave, under the relentless pressure of abuse and control. Sarah's personality began to change alarmingly. From a gentle and shy girl, she became aggressive and withdrawn. Her behavior grew erratic. She started killing rabbits purchased from a pet store, skinning and eating them. Harold witnessed these acts and even laughed, showing a complete lack of compassion or concern for Sarah's deteriorating mental state. Sarah's substance abuse, alcohol consumption, and use of antidepressants also worsened. She initially used milder substances but progressed to stronger ones. However, none of these could alleviate her despair and pain. Sarah spiraled into self-destruction, and violent impulses began to emerge in her mind during fits of rage. Sarah started contemplating murder and felt a strong urge to act on these impulses. This may have been a sign that her psyche had been so severely damaged that she could no longer control her violent urges. 3 days before Harold Sasko's body was discovered, Sarah took a decisive step. While Harold was busy with home repairs, she went to a pharmacy and purchased sleeping pills. This was not a spontaneous act, but part of a plan she may have been formulating for some time. On the evening of January 14th, Sarah began executing her plan. She slipped sleeping pills into the beer Harold was drinking, starting with the 3rd can. In total, she administered 5 pills. The combination of sleeping pills and alcohol created a dangerous effect, causing Harold to gradually lose consciousness. Once Harold was fully unconscious, Sarah tied his hands and feet. However, Harold briefly regained consciousness and began mumbling. This may have been the moment he realized the danger he was in. Sarah, in a state of extreme psychological distress and possibly out of control, stabbed Harold multiple times in the neck. The wounds were so severe that his throat was nearly severed completely. After killing Harold, Sarah performed a deeply symbolic act. She used his blood to write the word freedom on the bathroom wall. This act suggests that, in Sarah's mind, killing Harold was seen as an act of liberation from his control and abuse. Afterward, Sarah washed herself, changed clothes, and prepared to flee the scene. She took cash, a tablet, and Harold's car. A crucial detail is that Sarah intentionally left her phone at the scene to avoid being tracked, indicating a degree of calculation in her escape. Sarah drove Harold's car away from Kansas, heading toward Texas. However, finding the weather too cold, she continued south to Florida. Throughout this journey, Sarah slept in the car and rested at highway stops. During this time, Sarah took another symbolic action. She got a second tattoo with a lengthy quote, "Beware of the dark pit at the bottom of our heart." in its icy black depths dwell strange twisted creatures that are best not disturbed. This tattoo, along with her first one reading, "Only God can judge me," reflected her complex and conflicted mental state. On January 17, 2014, Harold's co-workers reported him missing when he failed to show up at work. Police arrived at his home and, peering through a window, discovered his body in a pool of blood. After breaking down the door, they confirmed Harold's death. Forensic examination revealed that Harold died from neck wounds. Investigation of the scene uncovered beer cans containing sedatives, and crucially, Sarah's phone was found at the scene. Initially, police suspected Sarah might have been kidnapped. However, the first clue to a different truth emerged when Sarah called her workplace to request time off due to a family member's death. She also contacted her grandmother from a payphone at a convenience store. Police traced the calls and reviewed security footage from the convenience store. From this evidence, they determined Sarah had traveled from Kansas to Texas alone, with no signs of abduction. At this point, Sarah became the prime suspect in the murder. On January 25, 2014, 11 days after the crime, police found Sarah, then 19, sleeping in Harold's car at Everglades National Park, Florida. During the search, police discovered Sarah was carrying a concerning amount of weaponry: 2 guns, 1 loaded, drugs, an axe, and 2 knives. The presence of these weapons raised questions about Sarah's true intentions after killing Harold. During her initial interrogation, Sarah admitted to killing Harold Sasko. She detailed the abuse she had endured and maintained that killing him was the only way to escape his control and abuse. Sarah described how Harold had manipulated and controlled her for years, from creating financial dependency to sexually abusing her and using drugs to weaken her. She emphasized that she felt she had no other option but to kill him to break free. However, the police presented an entirely different narrative to the public and in their reports. According to this version, Sarah was a psychopath with a desire to experience killing. While Harold was a kind man who had helped her in her time of need, police portrayed Harold as a good-hearted, devout Christian who extended a helping hand to a troubled young girl. They argued that Sarah had taken advantage of his kindness and killed him brutally to satisfy her violent desires. A critical element in the case was the discovery of text messages Harold sent to Sarah, in which he apologized for forcing her into sexual intercourse. These messages could have drastically altered how the jury viewed the case, as they provided concrete evidence of Harold's abuse. However, these messages were not presented to the jury. The reason for this decision may have been to protect Harold's reputation posthumously or to ensure Sarah received the harshest possible sentence. During the interrogation, Sarah described the urges to kill she felt during fits of rage. This was used by prosecutors to argue that she killed Harold not to escape violence, but to experience the act of killing. Prosecutors portrayed Sarah as a psychopath with violent tendencies, using her descriptions of murder urges as evidence of her true motives. In February 2014, the trial of Sarah Gonzalez McLean officially began. It was one of the most high-profile cases in Kansas at the time, not only due to the brutality of the crime, but also because of the complex questions about motive and criminal responsibility. Sarah's defense team chose a bold strategy. They argued that Sarah suffered from dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder, as a coping mechanism for the abuse she had endured. According to this theory, Sarah had developed multiple personalities to deal with severe psychological trauma. The defense claimed that the killing of Harold was carried out by one of these alternate personalities, and the real Sarah could not be held responsible for the act. They attempted to prove Sarah was not guilty by reason of mental disorder, arguing that she lacked the ability to control her actions at the time of the crime. This was a complex legal strategy, requiring proof of both the existence of the disorder and its impact on Sarah's judgment. However, this strategy failed completely. The jury was not convinced by the argument about dissociative identity disorder. They may have found the strategy too complex or lacking sufficient medical evidence to support it. This failure could be attributed to several factors. Dissociative identity disorder is a controversial diagnosis in the psychological community. Proving its existence requires complex evidence that the defense may not have had, and the jury may have been swayed by the prosecution's portrayal of the case. Prosecutors constructed an entirely different narrative, describing the relationship between Sarah and Harold as consensual. They argued that Sarah was not a victim of abuse, but rather someone who benefited from Harold's generosity. The prosecution presented evidence suggesting Sarah purchased drugs herself and had planned to kill Harold in advance. They introduced text messages Sarah sent to her sister about getting rid of Harold, as well as her internet search history about vulnerabilities in the human neck in the month leading up to the crime. This evidence was used to prove that Sarah had premeditated the killing, and it was not an act of self-defense or loss of control, but a deliberate crime. A significant factor influencing the jury's decision was that they were not informed of the text messages in which Harold apologized to Sarah for forcing her into sexual intercourse. Without this information, the jury only heard the prosecution's version of a benevolent Harold and a violent Sarah. Moreover, Sarah's admission of murder urges during fits of rage likely created an image of a psychopathic killer in the jury's eyes. They may have felt that Sarah posed a danger to society and needed to be isolated. On September 4, 2015, when Sarah was 21 years old, the jury delivered its verdict guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. This is one of the most serious charges in the U.S. justice system, typically applied to killings planned in advance and executed brutally. The sentence Sarah received was life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 50 years. This meant that, barring any changes, Sarah would remain in prison until 2065, when she would be 71, before having a chance for parole. After the trial, information about Harold's abuse of Sarah, which had been withheld from the jury, was revealed by the media and garnered significant public attention. This raised serious questions about the fairness of the trial and whether Sarah had received a just hearing. Many began to question why this critical evidence was not presented during the trial, when the abuse information was revealed. Many started to view the case differently. Instead of seeing Sarah as a psychopathic killer, they began to see her as a victim of a complex system of abuse. Sarah's story was placed in a broader context of sexual violence, power abuse, and how the justice system treats victims of such crimes. Many argued that Sarah had been betrayed twice, first by Harold through his abuse, and second by the justice system through the suppression of evidence of that abuse. In 2021, after years of appeals and legal advocacy, a significant agreement was reached. Sarah and her legal team successfully negotiated with prosecutors to reduce the time she must serve before being eligible for parole from 50 years to 25 years. Although Sarah remained sentenced to life imprisonment, she can now apply for parole after 25 years instead of 50. This means that in 2040, when Sarah is 46, she will have the opportunity to seek early release. This agreement was seen as an indirect acknowledgement that certain aspects of the case were not fully considered during the initial trial. However, it also highlighted the complexity of the justice system in balancing punishment for a crime with recognition of mitigating circumstances. The Sarah Gonzalez McLean case raises profound questions about the nature of justice and how the legal system handles complex cases involving abuse and psychological trauma. Was Sarah truly a brutal killer, or was she a victim of an abusive system pushed to her breaking point? The suppression of critical evidence about Harold's abuse raises questions about transparency and fairness in the justice system. Had the jury been aware of Harold's apologetic text messages, would they have reached a different verdict? This case also highlights the challenges of understanding and addressing cases involving severe psychological trauma. Sarah endured multiple traumas from childhood sexual abuse, family violence, and later a prolonged abusive relationship with Harold. How can the justice system balance punishing a crime with recognizing the impact of psychological trauma on a person's behavior? Should individuals with a history of severe trauma be treated differently in the justice system? The Sarah Gonzalez McLean case has become a landmark in discussions about sexual violence, power abuse, and how victims of such crimes are treated in the justice system. It raises questions about whether reforms are needed in how such cases are handled. Sarah's story also underscores the importance of recognizing and intervening early in cases of abuse. Had Harold's abusive behavior been identified and addressed sooner, could this tragedy have been prevented? To this day, the Sarah Gonzalez McLean case leaves many questions unanswered. Was Sarah truly a victim or a murderer? Can her actions be considered self-defense or a premeditated crime? And most importantly, did the justice system treat her fairly? These questions are not only significant for Sarah, but also for countless other victims of abuse and violence. How we answer these questions will shape how society treats those who have experienced trauma and may influence the future of the justice system. The Sarah Gonzalez McLean case is ultimately a painful reminder of the complexity of human nature and how the line between victim and perpetrator can sometimes be far less clear than we think. It challenges us to look beyond headlines and legal verdicts to understand the deeper, complex factors that create human tragedies.